In 1536, a man who had dedicated his entire life to serving his king knelt on a scaffold in London. He had been the king's most trusted advisor, his closest friend, the man who had solved every problem, smoothed every crisis, and never once asked for glory in return. His name was Thomas More, and Henry VIII, the king he had served with absolute loyalty, had just signed his death warrant. More's crime? He refused to lie. He refused to call the king's illegal marriage valid. He held to his conscience when every other advisor bent. His final words before the axe fell were these: "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." Noble, principled, nice. And it got his head removed from his body. Here is the uncomfortable pattern that history keeps repeating. The loyal advisor is executed. The honest general is betrayed. The principled leader is overthrown by the man willing to do what he would not. Nice guys finish last. You have heard it. You have probably felt it. But is it true? And if it is, why? By the end of this video, you will understand the mechanism, not just the pattern, but the reason behind it. And more importantly, you will see the difference between the niceness that destroys men and the strength that history actually rewards. This is not a permission slip for cruelty. This is a diagnosis. You have been in this position. Maybe not on a scaffold, but somewhere. The co-worker who took credit for your work, while you stayed quiet because confrontation felt wrong. The relationship where you gave everything, asked for nothing, and watched them leave for someone who gave them less. The promotion that went to the person who played politics while you played fair. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a voice whispered, maybe kindness is weakness. Maybe the world only respects teeth. That voice is not entirely wrong, but it is not entirely right either. The problem is not that you were kind. The problem is that you may have confused kindness with compliance, generosity with the absence of boundaries, decency with the inability to say no. History is filled with genuinely good men who were destroyed. But when you look closer, you find a pattern. They were not destroyed because they were good. They were destroyed because they failed to protect their goodness with wisdom. Machiavelli wrote that a man who wishes to be good in all things will come to ruin, among so many who are not good. But the key word is wishes, as in refuses to adapt, refuses to see the board, refuses to acknowledge that wolves exist. So let us examine the wolves, and let us examine the sheep who became their dinner. And most importantly, let us find the third path, the one history actually rewards. September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain stepped off a plane, waving a piece of paper. He had just returned from Munich, where he had negotiated with Adolf Hitler. The agreement was simple. Germany could annex part of Czechoslovakia. In exchange, Hitler promised no further expansion. Chamberlain declared to the cheering crowd, "I believe it is peace for our time." He was not a stupid man. He was not a coward. He had seen the First World War. He had watched a generation bleed out in the trenches. He wanted, desperately, to avoid that horror again. His motivation was kind. His intention was good. But his assumption was catastrophic. He assumed Hitler was a rational actor who wanted peace as much as he did. He projected his own values onto a man who did not share them. He believed that if he was reasonable, others would be reasonable in return. 11 months later, Germany invaded Poland. The piece of paper meant nothing. Chamberlain had not bought peace. He had bought Hitler time to prepare for war. Here is the mechanism. Nice, in this context, meant assuming the best about someone who had given every evidence of the worst. Chamberlain wanted to be the peacemaker. Therefore, he interpreted every signal through the lens of his own hopes, rather than his adversary's actions. This is not kindness. This is projection. And projection in a world of predators is a death sentence. By all accounts, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia was a devoted husband, a loving father, and a man who genuinely wished well for his people. He was also catastrophically unsuited to rule an empire. His diaries reveal a man more interested in his afternoon walks and his children's health than in the machinery of state. When advisors presented him with difficult decisions, he would agree with whoever spoke last. When crises erupted, he retreated into family life. He was not malicious. He was not greedy. He was, by most definitions, a nice man. But niceness does not govern. While Nicholas avoided confrontation, revolutionary movements organized. While he hoped things would settle down, breadlines grew. While he trusted that loyalty would hold, his generals plotted. In 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power. Nicholas, his wife, and all 5 of their children were executed in a basement in Yekaterinburg. The bullets did not care that he was kind. History did not care that he loved his family. The throne was not a place for men who could not make hard decisions, and so the throne was taken from him. Here is the mechanism. Nice, in this context, meant avoiding difficult decisions until the decisions were made for him. Nicholas confused being agreeable with being good. He confused not wanting conflict with maintaining peace. But conflict does not disappear because you refuse to engage with it. It merely grows until it engages you. A leader who cannot say no, who cannot fire, who cannot punish, who cannot risk being disliked, that leader creates a vacuum. And vacuums are always filled by those with fewer scruples. Marcus Aurelius is remembered as the last of the 5 good emperors of Rome. A philosopher king, a stoic who wrote meditations that are still read today. He was wise.
He was just.
He was, by most measures, good. But he made one decision that undid a century of careful succession. He named his biological son, Commodus, as his heir. Every emperor before him had adopted a capable successor. They chose competence over bloodline. But Marcus, out of love, out of hope, out of the blind spot that fathers have for sons, believed Commodus would grow into the role. He did not. Commodus was vain, cruel, and possibly insane. He fought as a gladiator in the arena. He renamed Rome after himself. He bankrupted the treasury. His reign began the long decline that would eventually collapse the empire. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher who understood human nature better than almost any ruler in history, could not see his own son clearly. Here is the mechanism. Nice, in this context, meant letting love override judgment. Marcus knew how to choose good men. He had done it his entire career. But when it came to his own blood, he made an exception. He wanted to believe. And that wanting blinded him to what was obvious to everyone else. The niceness of a father cost Rome its future. In 1898, a young Chinese emperor named Guangxu looked at his crumbling dynasty and decided to change everything. He launched the 100 Days Reform, a sweeping modernization program to transform China's education, military, government, and economy. He believed that if he moved quickly enough, he could save his nation from the fate of other colonized countries. His intentions were genuine, his vision was sound, his courage was real. But he made a fatal error. He trusted that the old guard would accept change because change was necessary. He underestimated one person in particular, Empress Dowager Cixi, the power behind the throne, who had no intention of surrendering her control. Within 3 months, Cixi launched a coup. The reforms were canceled. Guangxu's allies were executed. The emperor himself was placed under house arrest, where he remained for the next 10 years until his death. likely poisoned on Cixix's orders. Here is the mechanism. Nice, in this context, meant announcing your intentions to people who had every reason to destroy you. Guangxu believed that the rightness of his cause would protect him, that if he explained his reasoning clearly enough, even his enemies would see the logic. But power does not yield to logic. Power yields to power. He should have secured his position first, removed threats, built alliances, then reformed. Instead, he showed his hand to everyone at the table, and the table swallowed him whole. Louis XVI was not a tyrant. That was precisely his problem. When bread prices rose and the people starved, he genuinely agonized over their suffering. When the revolution began, he hesitated to use force against his own subjects. When his advisors urged him to flee, he delayed, hoping for reconciliation. He was not evil enough to crush the revolution early, but he was not wise enough to lead it. He occupied the worst possible position, too powerful to ignore, too weak to control events, and too decent to do what survival required. In January 1793, the Revolutionary Tribunal sentenced him to death. The vote was close, 361 to 360. If he had been slightly more ruthless years earlier or slightly more revolutionary in the moment, he might have lived. Instead, he was exactly what he had always been, a kind man in a role that did not reward kindness. Here is the mechanism. Nice, in this context, meant being unable to match the intensity of the moment. The revolution was not going to be resolved with gentle conversation. It was an earthquake, and Louis responded to an earthquake with the tools of a tea party. Sometimes history demands transformation, and leaders who cannot transform, who are too attached to who they have always been, are swept away. But wait, if history only rewards the ruthless, how do we explain Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Nelson Mandela?
These were not cruel men.
They were not Machiavellian schemers, and yet they succeeded where others failed. Here is the answer. They were not nice in the sense we have been discussing. They were good, which is an entirely different thing. Abraham Lincoln was kind, patient, and forgiving. He also fired generals who underperformed, suspended habeas corpus during wartime, and made decisions that killed hundreds of thousands of men because he judged the Union worth preserving. He was not nice. He was strategic compassion. He knew when to extend mercy and when to apply force. He chose his battles, literal and political, with precision. George Washington was gracious, honorable, and reluctant to seize power. He also executed deserters, crushed rebellions, and manipulated political factions to achieve his aims. He was not nice. He was disciplined virtue. He had boundaries, he had limits, and he enforced them without apology. Nelson Mandela forgave his jailers and preached reconciliation. He also spent decades as a revolutionary willing to use violence, built an underground military organization, and understood that forgiveness after victory is very different from forgiveness instead of strategy. He was not nice. He was patient strength. He chose reconciliation from a position of power, not from a position of weakness. Do you see the distinction? These men were not doormats who happened to win. They were dangerous men who chose to be good. They could have been tyrants. They had the power. They had the opportunity. But they exercised restraint, not because they were incapable of force, but because they judged restraint to be wiser. That is not niceness. That is mastery. History reveals three archetypes. The sheep, the man who is harmless because he has no capacity for danger. He avoids conflict because conflict frightens him. He gives because he cannot bear the tension of refusing. He is nice in the way that a prey animal is nice, by default, not by choice.
History devours sheep.
The wolf, the man who takes because taking is possible. He sees kindness as weakness and exploits it without hesitation. He wins in the short term, but rarely builds anything lasting. Empires of wolves collapse when a stronger wolf arrives. History remembers wolves, usually as cautionary tales. The warrior, the man who could be a wolf but chooses not to be. He is dangerous, and his danger is visible. But he channels that danger into protection rather than predation. He is kind because he has decided to be kind, knowing full well what cruelty costs. History rewards warriors. The problem with most nice guys is not that they are too good. It is that they are not yet dangerous enough to make their goodness meaningful. So let us return to Thomas More, kneeling on that scaffold in 1536. Was he a fool? Was his death a waste? Here is what most people miss. More knew what he was doing. He was not naive. He was not a sheep hoping the wolf would become vegetarian. He understood exactly what his refusal would cost him. He had watched others bend, watched them survive, and judged that survival on those terms was not worth having. His niceness was not weakness. It was a calculated act of defiance by a man who had weighed the cost and accepted it. He did not finish last because he was kind. He finished last in the game Henry VIII was playing, because he chose not to play that game at all. And here is the strange truth. 500 years later, we remember Thomas More as a saint. We remember Henry VIII as a monster. More lost his life, but he won history. Here is the lesson, forged in the fire of 5 centuries of evidence. Nice guys do not finish last. Weak men who call their weakness niceness finish last. The man who cannot say no is not kind. He is captive. The man who avoids all conflict is not peaceful. He is prey. The man who gives endlessly without boundaries is not generous. He is empty. But the man who can fight and chooses peace,
The man who can refuse and chooses to give.
the man who has power and wields it with restraint, that man is not nice. That man is good, and history bows to him. The wolves will always tell you that kindness is weakness. They have to. It is how they justify their teeth. But look closer at the men who shaped history, the ones whose names survived, whose work lasted, whose legacies still burn. They were not kind because they had no choice. They were kind because they had every choice, and chose it anyway. That is the fire worth carrying. Subscribe if you want to see the next pattern. The meek do not inherit the earth, but the strong, who choose mercy, they build it.